The harvest. In a hospital somewhere in Southeast Asia, a young woman wakes up in a bed she does not recognize. Her side burns with pain she cannot explain. There are stitches where no stitches should be, and when she tries to call for help, she realizes she is alone in a room with no windows and a locked door. She will never see her family again. She does not know it yet, but part of her body is already on an airplane, flying to a wealthy patient in another country who paid $200,000 for it. This is not a horror film. This is what Secret Elite discovered was happening across 11 countries simultaneously. This is Operation Crimson Harvest, the story of how an international coalition dismantled the largest organ trafficking network ever uncovered and saved hundreds of victims from a fate worse than death. The investigation began with a pattern that should not have existed. Medical intelligence analysts monitoring global health data noticed unusual clusters of kidney failure deaths in specific regions of Southeast Asia. Young, healthy individuals from impoverished communities were dying at rates that defied epidemiological explanation. The deaths were scattered across multiple countries, but they shared common characteristics. Victims were between 18 and 35 years old, had no prior health conditions, and had recently traveled away from their home villages. When investigators began examining these cases more closely, they discovered something disturbing. Many of the deceased had surgical scars consistent with organ removal, but there were no medical records indicating they had ever undergone surgery. Someone was harvesting organs from living people, and the victims were being left to die. Secret Elite assembled a task force within 72 hours of confirming the scope of the operation. Representatives from 14 nations gathered at a classified coordination center. Medical experts, intelligence officers, law enforcement commanders, and diplomatic liaisons confronted a crime so horrific that some had difficulty believing it was real. But the evidence was undeniable. A criminal organization had built a sophisticated organ trafficking network, spanning 11 countries across Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. They recruited victims from impoverished communities with promises of legitimate employment. They transported victims to clandestine surgical facilities. They removed organs under conditions that prioritized speed over survival. And they sold those organs to wealthy recipients willing to pay any price to avoid transplant waiting lists. The network had been operating for over 6 years. Intelligence estimates suggested they had trafficked organs from over 800 victims. The mortality rate for organ donors was approximately 40%. Over 300 people had been murdered for their organs, and the network was preparing to expand operations dramatically. Think about this for a moment. Let it sink in. Somewhere in the world, there are people who view other human beings as nothing more than containers for valuable biological material. They calculate the worth of a human life against the market price of a kidney, a liver, a cornea. They have built supply chains for human organs as efficiently as corporations build supply chains for consumer products. This is evil in its purest form, and Secret Elite was the only force capable of stopping it. The intelligence revealed a network of terrifying sophistication. Recruitment cells operated in impoverished regions of Cambodia, Vietnam, Myanmar, Bangladesh, and the Philippines. They targeted young adults from families desperate for income. They promised jobs in factories, hotels, or construction sites in wealthier countries. They provided documentation, transportation, and advance payments that families used to pay debts or buy necessities. The victims believed they were traveling toward better lives. They were traveling toward surgical tables. Transit hubs in Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia processed victims through false identity documents. The network had corrupted immigration officials who facilitated border crossings without proper scrutiny. Victims were moved in small groups to avoid detection, often believing they were simply being relocated for work assignments. Surgical facilities operated in 4 countries. These were not back alley operations. The network had constructed or acquired legitimate medical facilities staffed by trained surgeons who had abandoned their ethical obligations for enormous payments. The facilities had proper equipment, sterile environments, and post-operative care capabilities. The sophistication was part of the horror. This was industrialized human exploitation. Distribution networks connected harvested organs to recipients across the Middle East and Europe. Wealthy patients who could not obtain organs through legitimate transplant systems paid premiums of $200,000 to $500,000 per organ. The network guaranteed compatibility matching, surgical success rates, and confidentiality. The recipients did not ask where the organs came from. They did not want to know. At the center of the network stood a figure known only as the surgeon. What a way now, seat. a former transplant specialist who had been expelled from medical practice in 3 countries for ethical violations. He had transformed his expertise into criminal enterprise. He personally oversaw the most complex procedures. He trained other surgeons in techniques that maximized organ viability while minimizing victim survival. He viewed his victims as livestock to be processed. Intelligence had been tracking fragments of this network for years, but the compartmentalized structure, corrupted officials, and terrified survivors who feared speaking out had prevented comprehensive understanding, until a single brave survivor provided testimony that changed everything. A young woman who had been trafficked from Bangladesh and left for dead after kidney removal had survived against all odds. She had been found by local villagers, received emergency medical care, and eventually connected with humanitarian organizations. Her testimony provided the first comprehensive description of the network's operations. She described the recruitment process, the transit routes, the surgical facility, the faces of those who had operated on her, and most importantly, she remembered details that intelligence analysts could use to identify and locate other network components. Her courage would save hundreds of lives. Secret Elite began mapping the complete network with unprecedented urgency. In Phnom Penh, a recruitment operation worked through labor agencies that appeared legitimate. The agencies placed advertisements, conducted interviews, and processed paperwork just like legal employment services. But selected candidates were diverted to the trafficking network instead of actual jobs. Intelligence identified 31 individuals for arrest, including agency owners who had supplied over 200 victims. In Bangkok, a transit facility processed victims through medical examinations that secretly assessed organ compatibility. Victims believed they were receiving health screenings required for employment. They were actually being evaluated as merchandise. The facility was connected to a hospital network with corrupted administrators. In Kuala Lumpur, a surgical center operated in a private medical complex that appeared to specialize in legitimate transplant services. The facility performed real transplants for paying patients while secretly conducting criminal harvesting operations in separate wings. Over 40 medical professionals were identified as network participants. In Jakarta, a logistics operation coordinated victim transportation and organ distribution. The operation used commercial airlines, private medical transport services, and corrupted customs officials to move both victims and harvested organs across borders. Financial records revealed payments totaling over $400 million over 6 years. In Dubai, a distribution hub connected the network to wealthy recipients across the Middle East. The operation maintained waiting lists of patients, coordinated compatibility matching, and arranged post-transplant care. Recipients were told organs came from executed prisoners or accident victims with family consent. Each location presented unique operational challenges. The Phnom Penh recruitment operation was deeply embedded in communities where the network provided the only apparent economic opportunity. Arrests would need to be accompanied by victim identification and protection services. The Bangkok facility had connections to legitimate hospitals and government health ministries. Distinguishing complicit individuals from innocent staff required careful intelligence work. The Kuala Lumpur Surgical Center presented the most complex challenge. Active victims might be present during any intervention. Medical equipment needed to be preserved as evidence, and the facility's legitimate patients required protection. The Jakarta Logistics Hub controlled communications that could warn other network components. Any operation would need to secure communications infrastructure before other teams moved. The Dubai distribution operation existed in a jurisdiction with complex relationships to all parties involved. Diplomatic negotiations at the highest levels were required, but the most urgent challenge was the victims currently in the network's control. Intelligence indicated that approximately 140 victims were currently being held at various stages of the trafficking process. Some had been recently recruited and were in transit. Others were being held at surgical facilities awaiting procedures. Still others were recovering from operations and might face additional harvesting or elimination. Every hour of delay meant more victims undergoing irreversible procedures. Secret Elite coordinated the most complex simultaneous operation in its history. Medical teams from 8 countries were briefed on emergency protocols for organ trafficking victims. Surgical specialists prepared to provide immediate care for victims who had recently undergone procedures. Psychological support teams readied trauma intervention protocols. Special operations units from 12 countries received classified briefings on their specific targets. The operations required coordination across 6 time zones with precision timing to prevent any component from warning others. Diplomatic teams worked continuously to secure permissions from governments that were not fully aware of corruption within their own institutions. Some negotiations required convincing officials that their colleagues were complicit in the network. Intelligence assets confirmed the current location of every known facility, the identity of every identified network member, and the approximate number of victims at each location. 9 days before the next scheduled batch of victims was to undergo procedures, Secret Elite received final operational confirmation. All elements were in position. Over 2,000 personnel across 14 countries stood ready. Medical teams were staged near every target location. Evidence collection specialists had protocols for preserving both physical and digital records. The operation was scheduled for execution in 72 hours. Then intelligence intercepted communications that accelerated everything. The surgeon had become suspicious. Unusual questions from corrupted officials. Surveillance detection by security personnel. The instincts that had kept him free for 6 years were warning him of danger. He was ordering accelerated procedures at all facilities. Victims scheduled for operations over the coming weeks would be processed within 48 hours, and victims who had already undergone harvesting would be eliminated to prevent testimony. Secret Elite had less than 2 days to save over 100 lives. Within 6 hours, all 14 operational commands confirmed readiness for immediate execution. Medical teams moved to final staging positions. Special operations units began approach movements. Intelligence assets activated emergency protocols to monitor network communications. At exactly 0400 hours local time at the first target, Secret Elite launched Operation Crimson Harvest. The operations unfolded in carefully sequenced phases designed to prevent warning and maximize victim survival. In Jakarta, the first target, special operations teams seized the logistics hub that controlled network communications. Within 7 minutes, all outgoing communications were blocked. The network's ability to warn other components was eliminated before anyone knew the operation had begun. 14 individuals were arrested. Server rooms containing 6 years of operational records were secured intact. Simultaneously, teams in Dubai moved on the distribution hub. The operation required coordination with local authorities who had been briefed only hours earlier. 12 individuals were arrested, including medical coordinators who had matched organs to recipients. Financial records revealed the identities of hundreds of recipients across the Middle East and Europe. 20 minutes after the Jakarta operation, teams hit the surgical facilities. In Kuala Lumpur, the assault on the medical complex required extraordinary precision. Intelligence indicated that 16 victims were present at the facility, including 4 who were scheduled for procedures that morning. The complex also contained legitimate patients who required protection. Special operations teams breached the facility from multiple entry points. Medical personnel in the legitimate wings were secured and separated from the investigation. Teams moved through the complex systematically, clearing each area and identifying victims. They found 23 victims, not 16. 7 additional individuals had been brought to the facility within the past 48 hours as part of the accelerated schedule. 3 victims were already in pre-operative preparation. They were removed from the surgical suite and transferred to legitimate medical care within minutes of the breach. The surgeons who had been preparing to operate were arrested on the spot. 4 victims who had undergone procedures within the past week required immediate medical attention. Secret Elite medical teams provided emergency stabilization before evacuation to legitimate hospitals. The remaining victims were in various states of captivity within the facility. Some had been held for days, believing they were waiting for work assignments. Others had been held for weeks, understanding exactly what awaited them but unable to escape. The operation at the facility took 3 hours. Every victim was rescued. Every network member was arrested. In Bangkok, the transit facility operation revealed the scale of victim processing. Teams breached the facility, expecting to find a medical screening operation. They found a processing center that had evaluated over 500 potential victims in the past year alone. Medical records documented compatibility assessments for every major organ type. Financial records showed payments to recruitment networks across Southeast Asia. 31 individuals were arrested, including medical professionals who had conducted the evaluations knowing exactly how the information would be used. 11 victims currently being held for transit were rescued. In Phnom Penh, operations targeted the recruitment network. Teams simultaneously raided labor agencies across the city. The arrests needed to be coordinated to prevent any agency from warning others or destroying records. 31 individuals were taken into custody within a 2-hour window. The agency's records revealed the identities of every victim they had supplied over 6 years. The information would enable investigators to notify families, identify deceased victims, and understand the full scope of the network's operations. Similar operations executed across 7 additional countries, where network components had been identified. In Vietnam, a recruitment cell was dismantled. In Myanmar, a transit point was seized. In Bangladesh, victim identification teams began the painful work of notifying families. In the Philippines, corrupted officials who had facilitated trafficking were arrested. By the end of the first operational day, 11 countries had conducted simultaneous operations. Over 200 network members were in custody. 73 victims had been rescued from active trafficking situations. But the most important target remained. The surgeon himself was located at a private estate in a Southeast Asian country that cannot be named. He had retreated there when he sensed the operation beginning, believing his connections would protect him. He was wrong. Secret Elite coordinated with national authorities who understood the importance of the target. Special operations teams approached the estate through difficult terrain. The surgeon's security personnel were neutralized before any alarm could be raised. When teams breached the main residence, they found the surgeon attempting to destroy digital records. His computers contained documentation of every procedure he had personally performed or supervised. The records confirmed over 800 victims. They confirmed 327 deaths. They confirmed the identities of surgeons, coordinators, and recipients across the entire network. The man who had built an empire on human organs was taken into custody. His expression, according to team members present, showed only calculation. He was already thinking about legal strategies, about jurisdictional complications, about the wealth he had hidden in untraceable accounts. He did not understand that this time was different. This time, the evidence was complete. This time, the international community was unified. This time, there would be justice. Consider what was prevented by Operation Crimson Harvest. 142 victims were rescued from active trafficking. These individuals would have undergone organ removal procedures within days or weeks. Many would have died. All would have suffered permanent physical harm. 142 people who will now live complete lives. 142 families who will not receive notices that their loved ones died far from home. 142 futures that remain possible. The network's dismantling prevented the trafficking of an estimated 500 additional victims over the next 2 years. The recruitment networks were destroyed. The surgical facilities were closed. The distribution channels were severed. 500 people who will never be trafficked. 500 people who will find legitimate employment or remain safely in their communities. 500 families who will not experience the horror of losing a child to organ harvesters. The investigation continues to produce results months after the initial operations. Financial records have enabled the identification of over 400 organ recipients. While many received organs through legitimate belief they were ethically sourced, others clearly knew the origins of their transplants. Prosecutions are ongoing in 12 countries. Medical records have enabled the identification of victims who survived the network's operations. Support services are being provided. Families are being reunited. Survivors are receiving ongoing medical care for complications resulting from improper procedures. The testimony of survivors is being used to strengthen international protocols for transplant oversight. New verification systems will make it more difficult for future networks to operate. Over $480 million in criminal assets have been frozen or seized across 19 countries. Properties purchased with blood money have been confiscated. The financial infrastructure that sustained the network has been completely destroyed. The surgeon and 237 other individuals face prosecution in multiple jurisdictions. The charges include trafficking in persons, murder, assault causing bodily harm, and organized crime participation. The evidence is overwhelming. Many will spend the rest of their lives in prison. The network cannot reconstitute. Secret Elite operates in shadows so that others can live in light. The young woman in Bangladesh who will accept a legitimate job offer will never know how close she came to being trafficked. The family in Cambodia who will keep their daughter home will never know that the agency they almost trusted was a front for organ harvesters. The communities across Southeast Asia that remain intact will never know about the predators who had targeted them. This is the nature of Secret Elite operations. Success is measured not in headlines but in lives that continue, in families that stay together, in communities that remain whole, in the ordinary moments of daily life that persist because extraordinary actions occurred in secret. And somewhere in Southeast Asia, a young woman returns to her family. She had been rescued from a transit facility hours before she would have been transported to a surgical center. She does not fully understand what was planned for her. She only knows that people came to help her, that she is safe, that she is going home. She will find work. She will build a life. She will perhaps have children who will never know how close their mother came to disappearing forever. This is what Secret Elite prevented. This is why the task force exists. This is why international cooperation matters. How many operations like this happen without public knowledge? How many lives have been saved by interventions we will never hear about? Should Secret Elite have expanded authority to combat organ trafficking before networks grow to this scale? The world contains horrors that most people never see. but it also contains those who fight against those horrors in darkness. They ask for no recognition. They seek no fame. They want only to protect the innocent from predators who view human beings as commodities. Subscribe to Secret Elite for more stories of heroic interventions that saved lives the world never knew were at risk. Where evil exploits the vulnerable, Secret Elite is there, stopping predators before they can claim more victims. The shadows protect us all.